So these are 5 things that I think every theology PhD student needs to know. And these are going to be applicable not just to PhD students, for those who are going into theological education in general, but as one who just finished my PhD, I am thinking about it in that particular context. So the first is that you need to recognize that you don't know everything. And this is a kind of a joke among a lot of, seminary professors and pastors as well, is, first year seminarians think that they know everything and they think that they have all of the answers. And, I think we all go through this when we start studying theology. And I think I went through this more in undergrad than I did by the time I got to my master's degree, just because that was when I started studying started studying theology in the academy. And especially when you're kind of one who grabs onto theology maybe a little more academically than some other people. And you can definitely, as you start to learn, develop an attitude of, I know what I'm talking about. They don't know what they're talking about. And seminarians tend to do this all the time, first year seminarians, because you are excited about learning and you are excited about what you know. And those things are great, but it can definitely lead to a kind of arrogance in your attitude. And to be honest, the longer you study theology, the more you realize that you don't know. And I'm sure that's true probably in any field of academics. When you first jump into it, you learn all this information, you feel like you're on top of the world. And then the more you learn and the more you hear from other people, the more you realize that, wow, what you know is pretty inadequate. So along with that, I would say, especially for those who are, just getting into theology, because of the nature of social media and argumentation online today, I would urge you to stay away for a while. And I think there are some seminaries that have kind of implemented ideas now that you should stay away from blogging, podcasting, anything like that until you've finished your seminary degree. Because as a seminarian, it can be really bad. People can come off as combative and think that they know things. I've known people who got kicked out of seminary because of the way that they behaved on social media, and it's not good. So I say this as one who started blogging when I was in college. So I'm telling you that maybe it wasn't a good idea. It's what I did, but don't necessarily repeat what I've done. Because I've just seen, kind of since that time, and of course I don't know anything. When you're like 20 years old, what the heck do you know? But as I've seen, this continually, and I've seen people make a lot of mistakes through that. I think it's probably a better idea. And it doesn't mean you don't have to write it all, but don't get into long theological arguments online. Don't waste a lot of your time doing these kinds of things. You need to recognize there is a lot you don't know, and you need to step back and learn before you can put yourself out there. And yeah, the cage stage is a real thing too. This idea that when you first get into any theological position, you want to just argue about it, and you want to just shove it in everybody's face. You need to back off, study, pray, and at some point you have a level of maturity that you can then go out and really talk about these issues in a way that is mature and not just offensive. The second thing that I would urge, that I would say every PhD student needs to know, or anybody going into academics in general, is your ideas are not going to change the world. And your first publications are not going to be something that is going to change the field forever. And I think that this is a tendency that we all have. You get to write, you get invited to be a contributor to some project, or you get your first article published, or you get your thesis published, and at that point you're just convinced that this is going to be a really big deal because you put so much work into this, and you know the field, you know what you've been studying, and then it gets out there, and all of a sudden you're disappointed because it doesn't make some big splash as you might expect it to. And yeah, I had this experience myself. So my master's thesis was on, it's published as a book from Wippenstock, which is The Righteousness of One, an Evaluation of Early Patristic Soteriology in Light of the New Perspective on Paul. I know it's kind of a mouthful to say the whole title. And yeah, it's made sales, and people have bought it, and people have read it, and I've got reviews and comments on it. But when I wrote this thesis, I got all these comments from readers and friends of mine who are like, this is really good. This is a big deal. It's going to be impactful in terms of the new perspective on Paul and scholarship going forward. And, I just kind of on a whim sent my manuscript to Peter Lightheart and asked for a forward. I didn't expect that he was going to give me one. I just was like, I'm going to kind of shoot for the stars, grab a theologian who's a major figure, and see if he wants to write a forward. I didn't expect anything. And all of a sudden, a couple weeks later, I got the forward written that came back. So, coming into that with, this is my first publication. I've got this major, theological figure that I have a lot of respect for, writing a forward, and in the forward saying like this is going to have an impact on the field, and really in reality, like it doesn't. Okay, it had some reviews and some journals, and people have read it, but it's not like this kind of world changing text or something like that. And I think that we all have a tendency to do that in our fields, and we expect too much of what we're going to do. And the reality is, being a scholar, being a theologian, this is a lifelong enterprise. And the majority of people who do make an impact in any academic field don't do it when they're in their 20s. Because it takes years, it takes decades of reading and study and interaction with others and publications, sometimes before somebody really has a major impact. And we often look at those who had an impact at a young age and think, well, Athanasius was in his 20s when he wrote, on the incarnation of the word, or, Calvin was 27 when he wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion. So we can, do that at that age. And it's reality, it's not going to happen. it's just not. And that's okay. It takes a lot of hard work and decades of work. And that's just how things function. And it might not be that you have, a major kind of breakthrough or something that's really impactful in a field of scholarship until you're in your 50s or 60s. And that's okay. And it doesn't mean your work is worthless at all. People will read it and people will benefit from it, but it may be a small group of people, and that's okay. It's okay. And I think a lot of people, especially when they go into more specific fields, like you're studying, Edwards scholarship or something that is so narrow, you tend to think this is going to be published and a bunch of people are going to buy it, and you got like 3 people that bought the book, and that's okay. But it doesn't mean that it's not going to impact people. It doesn't mean that it's not going to have an influence on those who are going into those fields, and it might have a profound influence on somebody. But don't expect it to be, don't expect to be the next, kind of major public intellectual figure or something from just publishing an article or a dissertation on some obscure theological topic. So the third thing that I think every PhD theology student needs to know is that you're going to get rejected a lot. Your articles are going to get rejected a lot. You're going to have book proposals that are rejected, and it's going to be really frustrating. When you spend a lot of time writing an article, and you spend a lot of time on some kind of project, and you send it into a journal, you're hopeful, and then they say no, and you might send it to another journal and they'll say no. And it could be that your project gets sent from journal to journal and everyone says no. And that's really hard to hear, because none of us like to hear when we put a lot of work into something that it's not valuable. But sometimes it might not be. And you might think that your work is worth a lot more than it is. And you have to be ready for rejection. You have to be okay with that. And it's something that I've learned a lot just since I've been publishing. Is like you've got to get thick skin. You can't be thin skinned, because if you're sensitive about every rejection, if you're sensitive about every criticism, you shouldn't go into academics, because it is a world of criticism. It is a world of critique and sometimes even personal attack. And it's just all of the messiness that comes into you putting something out there specifically to be reviewed. You're putting it out there to be critiqued. If you send an article to a journal, you're putting it out there for scholars to look at it and to criticize it. And through those criticisms, you can either take it one of two ways. You can take the criticism and just get offended and insist that your work is amazing anyway, or you can take those criticisms and actually think about them and recognize that, yeah, people who have been in the field longer and who have been reading articles for a long time probably know a little better than I do. And that's really the way that you need to take it. I mean, the book of Proverbs talks about this over and over again, this idea that you need to be open to criticism and actually listen to people when they criticize you. And, there's a difference. Of course, there are going to be people who just attack you for no reason, or there are going to be people who attack you. And we'll talk about this in the next reason. But there are going to be people who are unnecessarily critical for one reason or another. And just because you do get rejected by one journal, by the way, doesn't mean that your work is worthless. There are so many factors that get involved in that. And it could be that journal just got a lot of pretty good articles, and yours might be worthy of publication, but they happen to take others. It could be that the focus of your article is different than what that journal wants to focus on at the time. It could be that it's not relevant to the particular topic that journal wants to discuss more than others. And one thing that I have found, particularly coming from a Lutheran perspective, is it is kind of hard in some ways to make connections with publishers, journals who are coming from a more of an evangelical perspective, because Lutherans are so kind of in the middle in some ways. We're in between. We're not really Protestant in the full sense of what most people mean by that, but we're not Roman Catholic. And you can be kind of in a weird kind of middle ground. And if your work is very specific to one theological tradition and you are submitting proposals to a journal that is broader, sometimes it just might not be what they're looking for. So there are a bunch of reasons that why your articles could be rejected. So don't just assume that I submitted it once, I got rejected, I submitted a book proposal, it got rejected, I'm throwing it out, that's it. It doesn't mean your work is worthless. But do listen to criticism and you can ask questions. And this is something that I've done when I submit it. Why wasn't this accepted? Is there something I could do to improve it? And those kind of suggestions are what you can use to improve yourself in the future and the work that you do. So be open to criticism. Don't just shut it down. Don't just be argumentative. And also don't respond to every piece of criticism. And I could give that as well. And I say this as one who's probably responded to too much criticism, at least at one point, and now I just kind of ignore it. Now, the fourth thing every theology PhD student needs to know, and this is the thing that was so hard for me, and it continues to be hard for me and really frustrating to me, and that is that the world of academics in theology is just as full of arrogance and sin and division and politics as any other area of academia. And I think when I went into theology, I had this very naive view that, well, these are Christians doing this work, so they're going to treat academics a little differently. They're not going to be as arrogant about it. They are going to be kinder, more forgiving to each other. It's not going to be, these politics and all of this other stuff. And boy, was I wrong. The world of theology is a mess. Just because someone has good academic credentials in their theology also does not mean that they really bear fruits of the Spirit. And that's something that you will learn very, very quickly, is doctrinal knowledge and personal piety do not always go together. And you kind of assume that they do. Now, I've thought through this and how much I want to share because I have some weird experiences. So let me just, and I'm not going to use names or anything because I don't want to get into the politics. And you could probably figure this out if you tried, but just don't. It doesn't matter what the journal is. Doesn't matter what I'm talking about. Just hear me out without having to worry about what the specifics are at all. But there's a particular theological journal where some of the editors are opposed to a lot of the work that I've done because of the theological stances I've taken on certain issues. And they're very much aware of the work that I've done. And so because of their opposition to the work that I've done, every time I publish a book, they try to get a review out, and they very purposefully grab a particular reviewer who is opposed to what I've done, so that they can get a negative review out and try to stop people from reading the books. To be honest, in reality, it doesn't work because people are more curious because you start controversies and people read that and say, this doesn't seem fair. There's something weird going on here. What's this all about? And it actually has helped my book sales. So, I mean, I can't complain too much in that way. But let me just give you a little story of something that happened one time. There was a particular book of mine that was published. And after that book was published, there was a review that was written pretty quickly, like right away. And that review was submitted to this journal, and it was a largely positive review. It wasn't devoid of any criticisms at all, but it was definitely a more positive review. And this person interacted with me, so I knew that they were reading the book and reviewing it for this particular journal. Now they submitted a review to that journal, and this review was somebody with good academic credentials. It was a well-written review. There was not necessarily any reason why they would have rejected it. But some time passed. The editors never responded to this review, so he sent another email and said, I submitted this review. What's going on? Is this going to get published? And then the person got back, this particular editor, and said, I'm sorry, we already have somebody else reviewing the book, so we can't accept your review. Okay, that sounds fine. Those kind of things happen. Well, I actually found out from the other reviewer that was asked to review the book after this. They said, oh, I was just asked today by the editor of this journal to review your book. And so here's what happened, is someone submitted a positive review of my book, and the editor didn't want to publish a positive review of my book. And so because of that, he contacted someone who would be opposed to the ideas in the book so that he could publish a negative review. Grabbed that person, said, will you commit to writing a review so I can go back and tell this other person there's already a review because we don't want to publish a positive review of this guy's book. And so that's exactly what happened. And so that's the kind of politics that go on. And I'm sure this is not unique to me. These things happen all over the place. I've made a lot of enemies in theology and academia, and that's just the way it is. To be honest, I find myself like I'm not like a very argumentative person in a lot of ways. The kind of person that really makes enemies at all in real life. But within the world of theology, it happened. This happened to me initially when I was very young, and I think I didn't know how to handle it at the time. But it is what it is at this point. But just be aware of that, when you're going into this, and that's more of an extreme circumstance. But yeah, if you're in the right fields with the right divisions and sides and whatever, this is going to happen to you. So just be aware of it and don't be surprised when it happens. And the fifth thing that you need to know is that getting a PhD in theology doesn't mean you're going to get a job. And this is true of so many academic fields. There's an oversaturation of people with PhDs, and there are not enough positions for everyone to get a job in that field. And so you might graduate, you get a PhD. It could be from somewhere great. It could be you could have written an amazing dissertation. You could have gotten numerous articles published before you graduate, and you may still not get a job. There just are not that many jobs out there. So I would just encourage you, if you're really wanting to just go into academia and get a PhD in theology, maybe consider doing something else. I don't know what else. I mean, it sounds like tough advice because that may be what you really want to do with your life. But you have to be open to looking into other interrelated fields. And so you may be writing, you may be doing a PhD, but also be taking a job in something related to ministry in one way or another. I mean, there are positions with publishing houses. You could get into theological publishing. You could work for some kind of Christian ministry organization. There are a lot of pastors who get PhDs who don't ever end up teaching, at least not in a full-time capacity, but remain in the pastoral ministry. And they also write as kind of a side thing that they enjoy doing. That's what I started doing. And now I'm kind of in I was open to a position, something that's not quite academia, but in a very academic setting. And I'm doing ministry on a Ivy League campus. So there's a kind of a mix of both of those. It's a very much an academic environment. But I wasn't, getting a job just teaching. And from my perspective, where I'm at, it would be really hard. I mean, if I were to try to get a job in academia, I don't even know where I would get a job because I'm not in the LCMS, which means I probably would at least be a second pick at any of the schools, the Concordia seminaries or the undergrad schools as well. So I probably wouldn't, be a first choice because I'm not in the synod, even though I'm in fellowship with them. The AALC, we don't have full-time seminary professors. I do teach adjunct at our seminary. And then within broader evangelicalism, if you look at those seminaries and if you look at their statements of faith, they usually are specific enough to not allow someone who has Lutheran convictions on things. I'm okay with that. I recognize that I'm probably not going to have an academic position, at least in that way. But I'm actually pretty happy with what I'm doing, and I really enjoy it, and I believe God has called me to this position, and I really enjoy it. But you have to be open to that. You can't just come with the assumption that I will get a PhD and I will get a job in academia. And if you are not willing to do something else that might be somewhat related to that, then don't do it. It's not worth the work, because it's an immense amount of work. It's going to in some ways hurt your relationship with your family if you're not careful. It's going to take up tons of your time. It's going to be a lot of money, and after all of this, you may get no job. That's the harsh reality. It stinks, but that's the reality. You may find adjunct positions, lecturing, but an adjunct position can't pay your bills. So you're going to have to do something else. I know that's kind of a downer to end on, but you've just got to be realistic. And it doesn't mean it's not worth pursuing a PhD. I did a PhD because I love writing, and I really enjoy it. It's something that I do in my free time, which you guys, I'm sure, know from listening and watching the stuff that I do. So yeah, that's it. Those are 5 things that I think every PhD theology student should know, and hopefully that's helpful for you.